In the world of military service, respect isn't given, it's earned. And sometimes, when that respect is threatened, the consequences can be swift and shocking. What happens when years of training, discipline, and inner strength collide with ignorance and aggression in just a few seconds? This is the true story of Private Sarah Mitchell, a quiet soldier who never looked for trouble, but wasn't about to back down when it found her. In a crowded mess hall, surrounded by her fellow soldiers, she would face a moment that would define not just her military career, but her entire life. Sometimes the smallest person in the room carries the biggest surprise, and sometimes justice comes in the most unexpected package. Sarah Mitchell had never imagined herself in uniform. Growing up in the small farming town of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, her life had been filled with early morning chores, helping her father with the cattle, and dreaming of something bigger than the endless cornfields that stretched beyond their property line. At 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing barely 115 pounds, she looked more like someone who belonged in a college library than on a military base. But appearances, as everyone would soon learn, could be incredibly deceiving. Her childhood had been shaped by hardship in ways that most people never experienced. When Sarah was 12, her mother had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a disease that gradually robbed her of mobility and independence. Her father, a quiet man named Robert Mitchell, worked double shifts at the local grain elevator to pay for medical bills while trying to keep their small farm running. Sarah found herself stepping into roles that most children never had to consider, becoming a caretaker, a farmhand, and the emotional backbone of a family that was slowly crumbling under the weight of circumstances beyond their control. The responsibility had forged something unbreakable within her. While other kids her age were worried about homework and weekend plans, Sarah was learning how to manage medications, help her mother with basic daily tasks, and handle livestock that outweighed her by several hundred pounds. She developed a quiet strength that came from necessity rather than choice, and a determination that would serve her well in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Her decision to join the military came during her senior year of high school. The medical bills had mounted to an impossible level, and her father's health was beginning to suffer from the stress and overwork. College seemed like an impossible dream when every dollar was needed to keep the family afloat. One autumn afternoon, while helping her mother with physical therapy exercises, Sarah made a decision that would change the trajectory of her entire life. "I'm going to join the Army," she announced quietly during dinner, her words cutting through the usual silence that had become common in their household. Her father looked up from his plate, his weathered hands pausing mid-motion. "Sarah, honey, you don't have to do that. We'll figure something out." But Sarah had already made up her mind. She had researched the benefits, the educational opportunities, and, most importantly, the signing bonus that could help ease her family's financial burden. "I want to do this, Dad. It's not just about the money. I want to serve something bigger than myself." Her mother, speaking slowly due to the progression of her illness, managed to express her concerns. "The military is dangerous, sweetheart, and you're so small." Sarah smiled at this, expression that held more confidence than anyone expected from someone so young. "Mom, size isn't everything. You taught me that when you kept fighting this disease, even when the doctors said you should give up." The conversation continued late into the night, but Sarah's resolve never wavered. She had inherited her father's stubbornness and her mother's fighting spirit, a combination that made her decision feel inevitable rather than impulsive. The recruiting process went smoothly. Sergeant First Class Martinez, a veteran recruiter with over 15 years of experience, was initially skeptical when the petite teenager walked into his office. He had seen plenty of young people who thought military service would be an adventure, only to wash out during the first week of basic training. But something about Sarah's quiet determination caught his attention. "What makes you think you can handle military life?" he asked during their initial interview, studying her carefully. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "I've been handling responsibility my whole life, Sergeant, taking care of sick family members, managing a farm, and working part-time jobs since I was 14. I'm not looking for adventure. I'm looking for a way to serve my country while building a future for myself." Her answers impressed him. Unlike many recruits who spoke in grand terms about patriotism and heroism, Sarah was practical and honest about her motivations. She understood that military service was work, not glory, and that appealed to the experienced recruiter. The physical fitness requirements posed a challenge. The Army's minimum standards were designed with larger, stronger recruits in mind, and Sarah would need to work harder than most to meet them. But she approached this obstacle the same way she had approached every challenge in her life, with methodical determination and a refusal to accept defeat. She spent 6 months preparing for basic training, rising at 4 in the morning to run the empty country roads around her family's farm. She converted their old barn into a makeshift gym, using hay bales for weight training and rope climbing. Her father, despite his concerns, helped her construct obstacle courses that mimicked what she would face at Fort Benning. The physical preparation was only part of her challenge. Sarah also spent hours studying military history, memorizing ranks and protocols, and learning everything she could about Army life. She understood that knowledge would be just as important as physical strength in proving herself worthy of a uniform. Her departure for basic training in January was emotional, but not dramatic. Her family had never been given to big displays of sentiment, and this moment was no different. Her father hugged her tightly, whispering advice about keeping her head down and working hard. Her mother, now confined to a wheelchair, but still sharp as ever, reminded her to trust her instincts and never let anyone convince her she didn't belong. "You're stronger than you look, baby girl," her mother said, gripping Sarah's hand with what strength she still possessed. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The bus ride to Georgia gave Sarah time to reflect on the magnitude of her decision. She was leaving behind everything familiar, stepping into a world where she would be tested in ways she had never experienced. The other recruits on the bus seemed larger, louder, and more confident than she felt. Some boasted about their athletic achievements, others about their family military traditions. Sarah listened quietly, absorbing everything while revealing little about herself. Fort Benning was overwhelming at first. The scale of the base, the constant noise and activity, and the sheer number of people created a sensory overload that took days to adjust to. Sarah had grown up in a place where silence was common and privacy was abundant. Now she found herself sharing space with dozens of other young women, all dealing with their own adjustments to military life. Her drill sergeants were exactly what she had expected, demanding and seemingly impossible to please. Staff Sergeant Williams, a compact woman with 20 years of experience and no patience for weakness, immediately identified Sarah as someone who might struggle with the physical demands of training. "Mitchell," she barked during their first formation, "are you sure you didn't take a wrong turn on your way to the Girl Scout meeting?" The comment drew snickers from some of the other recruits, but Sarah remained at attention, staring straight ahead. She had expected this type of treatment and was determined not to let it affect her focus. The first weeks of basic training were brutal. The physical training pushed Sarah to her limits and beyond, but she discovered reserves of strength and endurance that surprised even her. More importantly, she began to understand that military training was as much about mental toughness as physical capability. While larger recruits struggled with long marches carrying heavy equipment, Sarah's farm strength and legs and back proved remarkably durable. While others complained about the early morning wake-ups and demanding schedule, Sarah found herself comfortable with a routine that was actually less demanding than her life back home had been. Her marksmanship scores were exceptional. The same steady hands that had helped her mother with delicate medical procedures proved perfectly suited for handling weapons with precision and care. Her attention to detail, developed through years of managing complex family responsibilities, made her a natural at the technical aspects of military equipment and protocols. But it was her leadership qualities that truly set her apart. During group exercises, Sarah's fellow recruits began turning to her for guidance and support. She had a gift for staying calm under pressure and for finding solutions to problems that seemed insurmountable to others. Her quiet confidence was infectious, and even the biggest, loudest recruits began to respect her judgment. The transformation was gradual, but undeniable. The uncertain farm girl who had arrived at Fort Benning was evolving into a competent, confident soldier. Her drill sergeants began to notice, and their initial skepticism was replaced by grudging respect. Mitchell, Sergeant Williams, said after a particularly challenging field exercise, "You keep surprising me. Maybe there's more to you than meets the eye." Sarah's response was characteristically understated. "I'm just doing what needs to be done, Sergeant." But privately, she felt a growing sense of pride and belonging. The uniform that had initially felt foreign now seemed like a natural extension of herself. The discipline and structure that had intimidated her at first now provided a framework that allowed her skills and strengths to flourish. Her graduation from basic training was attended by her parents, who had made the difficult journey from Iowa despite her mother's declining health. Seeing their daughter in uniform, standing tall and confident among her fellow soldiers, brought tears to their eyes. This was not the same young woman who had left home 6 months earlier. The ceremony was moving, but Sarah found herself already looking ahead to the next phase of her military career. She had been selected for advanced individual training as a military police officer, a specialization that would take her to Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. The choice reflected her superior's recognition of her leadership potential and her ability to handle complex, high-pressure situations. As she prepared to leave Fort Benning, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that dinner conversation back in Iowa. She had proven to herself and others that determination and character could overcome physical limitations. She had found a calling that satisfied both her practical needs and her desire to serve something greater than herself. The journey to Fort Leonard would bring new challenges and opportunities. Advanced training would test her in different ways, pushing her to develop skills in law enforcement, conflict resolution, and crisis management. She would learn about military justice, investigation techniques, and how to maintain order in high-stress situations. But perhaps most importantly, she was beginning to understand that her real strength lay not in her physical abilities, but in her ability to remain calm, think clearly, and act decisively when others around her were losing their composure. These qualities, forged in the challenges of her childhood and refined through military training, would serve her well in the months and years ahead. The bus pulled away from Fort Benning as Sarah watched the familiar buildings disappear in the distance. She felt a mixture of sadness at leaving a place where she had achieved so much growth and excitement about the adventures that lay ahead. Military life suited her in ways she had never expected, providing both the structure she needed and the challenges that allowed her to excel. Her fellow passengers were mostly other soldiers heading to various advanced training programs, and the conversations revealed the diversity of paths available in military service. Sarah listened to discussions about engineering specialties, medical training, and technical programs that would provide valuable skills for both military and civilian careers. Fort Leonard would represented the next step in her evolution as a soldier. The training would be more specialized and demanding, requiring her to master complex skills while maintaining the high standards she had established during basic training. But Sarah approached this challenge with the same methodical preparation and quiet determination that had carried her through every previous obstacle. As the landscape of Georgia gave way to the rolling hills of Missouri, Sarah Mitchell was no longer the uncertain farm girl who had first put on a uniform 6 months earlier. She was becoming something new, something stronger, something that would soon be tested in ways she could never have imagined. Fort Leonard would prove to be a different world entirely from basic training. Where Fort Benning had focused on breaking down civilian habits and building basic military discipline, the military police school was designed to create soldiers with specialized skills in law enforcement, security, and maintaining order. Sarah found herself surrounded by recruits who had already proven themselves during basic training, which meant the competition was fiercer and the expectations higher. Her barracks housed 36 women from diverse backgrounds, each bringing their own strengths and challenges to the program. There was Jennifer Park, a former college athlete from California who could outrun almost anyone on base. Maria Santos had grown up in Chicago and understood street dynamics in ways that most of the rural recruits couldn't match. Rebecca Thompson came from a military family and seemed to know protocols and procedures by instinct rather than study. Sarah's bunkmate was a tall, athletic woman named Amanda Knox from Alabama, who had worked as a security guard before enlisting. Amanda's first impression of Sarah was skeptical at best. "No offense," Amanda said during their first night, "but are you sure you're in the right program? Military police work can get pretty physical. You might be better suited for administrative or communications." Sarah had heard variations of this comment throughout her military career, and her response was always the same quiet confidence. "I appreciate your concern, but I think I can handle whatever they throw at us." What Amanda and the others couldn't see was the steel that had been forged during Sarah's childhood. They saw her size and assumed weakness, but they missed the countless hours of farm work, the late nights caring for her mother, and the emotional strength required to hold a family together during crisis. These experiences had created reserves of determination that weren't visible on the surface, but ran deeper than most people could imagine. The academic portion of MP training was intense. Students had to master federal and military law, learn investigation techniques, study crowd control procedures, and understand the complex regulations that govern military justice. Sarah's childhood experience with responsibility and attention to detail served her well in these studies. While other students struggled with the volume of information, she approached it systematically, creating detailed notes and study guides that soon became resources for her entire unit. Her instructors noticed her academic excellence quickly. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who taught criminal investigation procedures, was impressed by Sarah's analytical skills and her ability to think through complex scenarios logically. "Mitchell," he said after she had perfectly executed a mock investigation exercise, "you have a natural gift for this work. You see details that others miss, and you understand how pieces fit together." The physical training at Fort Leonard Wood was different from basic training. Rather than focusing on general fitness and endurance, MP training emphasized specific skills needed for law enforcement duties. Students learned defensive tactics, weapon retention techniques, and how to subdue suspects who might be larger and stronger than they were. This was where Sarah's size initially seemed like a significant disadvantage. During hand-to-hand combat training, she was often paired with much larger partners who outweighed her by 50 pounds or more. The early sessions were humbling, as she found herself overwhelmed by opponents who could simply overpower her through brute strength. But Sarah's approach to this challenge revealed the mental toughness that had been developing since childhood. Instead of becoming discouraged, she studied the techniques more carefully than anyone else. She arrived early for training sessions to practice moves, stayed late to work with instructors, and approached each exercise as a puzzle to be solved rather than a contest to be won. Sergeant First Class Thompson, the defensive tactics instructor, was a compact, muscular woman with extensive experience in military police operations. She had seen plenty of smaller soldiers struggle with physical confrontations, and she took a particular interest in Sarah's development. "Mitchell," she said after a particularly challenging training session, "you're thinking too much about being small. Your size isn't a weakness if you use it correctly. You're quicker than larger opponents. You can move in ways they can't, and you can use their size against them." This advice proved to be transformative. Sarah began to understand that effective defensive tactics weren't about matching strength with strength, but about using technique, timing, and leverage to neutralize advantages that opponents might have. She studied martial arts principles that emphasized redirecting force rather than opposing it directly. Her breakthrough came during a scenario-based exercise where students had to apprehend suspects who were resisting arrest. Sarah was assigned to work with a male student who was playing the role of an intoxicated soldier, causing a disturbance. He outweighed her by nearly 60 pounds and was instructed to resist arrest realistically. What happened next surprised everyone watching. Instead of trying to overpower her opponent, Sarah used a combination of precise timing and superior technique to control the situation. When he grabbed her uniform, she used his momentum against him, redirecting his force and taking him to the ground with a perfectly executed throw. When he tried to get back up, she applied a control hold that left him unable to move without causing himself pain. The entire sequence took less than 30 seconds, and it was executed with a calm precision that impressed both instructors and fellow students. More importantly, it demonstrated that Sarah had mastered the mental aspects of law enforcement that were often more important than physical strength. Word of her performance spread quickly through the training company. Students who had initially dismissed her as too small to be effective began to take notice. Her quiet confidence, which some had mistaken for weakness, was revealed to be something much more substantial. Amanda Knox, her initially skeptical bunkmate, became one of her strongest supporters. "I owe you an apology," she said after witnessing Sarah's performance during defensive tactics training. "I was wrong about you. You're not just tough, you're smart tough, which is way more dangerous." The academic and physical training were only part of what made MP school challenging. Students also had to master the psychological aspects of law enforcement, learning how to de-escalate conflicts, read situations accurately, and make quick decisions under pressure. These skills couldn't be taught through textbooks or physical exercises. They required a kind of emotional intelligence and situational awareness that came from experience and natural ability. Sarah excelled in these areas as well. Her childhood had taught her to read emotional undercurrents in family situations, to understand when someone was struggling even if they weren't expressing it directly, and to remain calm when others around her were becoming overwhelmed. These skills translated perfectly to law enforcement scenarios. During role-playing exercises where students had to handle domestic disputes, public disturbances, and other complex situations, Sarah demonstrated an unusual ability to calm tensions and find solutions that other students missed. She had a gift for listening carefully to what people were really saying, understanding the underlying issues that were driving conflicts, and addressing those root causes rather than just the surface problems. Instructor feedback consistently praised her judgment and decision-making abilities. Private Mitchell has an exceptional understanding of human behavior, wrote Captain Martinez in her midterm evaluation. She consistently chooses appropriate responses to complex situations, and she has a natural ability to gain compliance through communication rather than force. This feedback was particularly meaningful because it recognized abilities that went beyond what could be measured through traditional metrics. While other students might have better physical fitness scores or faster completion times on certain exercises, Sarah was developing the kind of comprehensive competence that would make her an exceptional military police officer. Her fellow students began seeking her advice and guidance during difficult training exercises. Despite being one of the smallest and youngest members of their class, Sarah found herself in informal leadership positions, helping others work through challenging scenarios and providing support when they were struggling with demanding coursework. This leadership development was noticed by their instructors, who began giving Sarah additional responsibilities and opportunities to demonstrate her capabilities. She was selected for advanced training exercises, chosen to lead training teams, and given chances to work directly with experienced MP officers on real-world scenarios. One particularly memorable exercise involved a mock riot control situation where students had to restore order to a simulated civil disturbance. Sarah was chosen to lead a team of 8 soldiers, and she had to coordinate their response while maintaining safety for both her team and the role-playing civilians. The scenario was designed to be overwhelming, with multiple problems occurring simultaneously and limited information about what was actually happening. Many student leaders had failed this exercise because they became focused on the immediate crisis and lost sight of the bigger picture. Sarah approached the challenge differently. Instead of trying to control every detail, she established clear communication protocols, delegated specific responsibilities to team members based on their individual strengths, and maintained a calm oversight perspective that allowed her to adapt to changing conditions. When the exercise concluded, the instructors were unanimous in their praise. "That was textbook leadership under pressure," commented Major Harrison, who had been observing the exercise. Private Mitchell demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and composure we want to see in military police officers. But perhaps the most significant aspect of her time at Fort Leonard Wood was how Sarah was beginning to understand her own potential. The farm girl who had enlisted primarily for financial reasons was discovering that she had genuine aptitude for military service and, more specifically, for the complex challenges of law enforcement. Her letters home during this period reflected growing confidence and sense of purpose. Where her early communications had focused on getting through training and surviving the demands, her later letters spoke about career goals, opportunities for advancement, and genuine excitement about the work she was preparing to do. "I think I found what I'm meant to be doing," she wrote to her parents during the final month of training. "This isn't just a job for me anymore. I'm good at this work, and I can make a real difference in people's lives." Her mother's response revealed how much pride her family felt in her transformation. "Your father and I always knew you were special, sweetheart. We're just glad the Army is finally giving you a chance to show the world what we've always seen in you." As graduation from MP school approached, Sarah's performance had earned her recognition as one of the top students in her class. She had achieved expert ratings in weapons training, scored in the top 5% on academic evaluations, and received consistent praise for her leadership potential and professional judgment. More importantly, she had gained the respect and friendship of her fellow students and instructors. The relationships she had built during training would become valuable professional networks throughout her military career, and the confidence she had gained would serve her well in the challenging assignments that lay ahead. Her first duty assignment would take her to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, home of the 101st Airborne Division. As a newly qualified military police officer, she would be responsible for maintaining order and security on one of the Army's largest and most active bases. The work would involve everything from traffic enforcement and criminal investigations to crowd control and emergency response. The night before graduation, Sarah's training company gathered for a farewell dinner. The atmosphere was celebratory, but also reflective, as students contemplated the end of an intense period of learning and growth. Sarah found herself surrounded by friends who had become like family during the demanding months of training. "You know," said Jennifer Park, the former college athlete who had initially seemed so much more prepared for military life, "when we started this program, I thought I had all the answers. But watching you these past few months has taught me that being tough isn't about being big or loud. You're the toughest person I know, and you never had to prove it by putting anyone else down." These words meant more to Sarah than any official recognition or award. The respect of her peers, earned through months of shared challenges and mutual support, represented something more valuable than individual achievement. She had learned that military service was ultimately about being part of something larger than herself, and she had found her place in that community. As she prepared to leave Fort Leonard Wood and begin her career as a military police officer, Sarah Mitchell had been transformed yet again. The basic training soldier who had arrived at MP school was now a confident, competent professional ready to take on real-world responsibilities. But the most important transformation was internal, a growing understanding of her own capabilities and potential for leadership. The young woman who had once worried about whether she was strong enough for military service now knew that strength came in many forms, and that her particular combination of intelligence, determination, and emotional resilience made her uniquely suited for the challenges ahead. She was ready for whatever came next, though she had no way of knowing that her greatest test was still to come. Fort Campbell sprawled across the Kentucky-Tennessee border like a small city, its 105,000 acres home to nearly 30,000 soldiers and their families. As Sarah's bus pulled through the main gate for the first time, she was struck by the scale and energy of the installation. This wasn't the controlled environment of a training base where everyone shared the same basic routine. This was an operational military installation where real missions were planned and executed, where soldiers prepared for deployments to dangerous places around the world. The 101st Airborne Division carried a legendary reputation that dated back to World War II. The Screaming Eagles had parachuted into Normandy on D-Day, held the line at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, and continued that tradition of excellence through conflicts in Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Sarah felt the weight of that history as she processed in and received her unit assignment. She was assigned to the 716th Military Police Battalion, specifically to Alpha Company, which was responsible for law enforcement operations on the base. Her new home would be a modern barracks complex that housed female MPs, and her immediate supervisor would be Staff Sergeant Patricia Williams, a veteran of 2 combat deployments with over 8 years of military police experience. Staff Sergeant Williams met Sarah at the company headquarters, a no-nonsense woman in her early 30s whose bearing immediately communicated competence and authority. She had the kind of presence that commanded respect without requiring threats or dramatics. And Sarah recognized in her the type of leader she hoped to become someday. "Welcome to the 716th, Mitchell," Williams said, reviewing Sarah's training records. "Your scores from MP school are impressive. Fort Leonard would speaks very highly of your potential. But school and the real world are two different things. Are you ready to find out what military police work is actually like?" Sarah's response was characteristic. "I'm ready to learn, Sergeant. I know I have a lot to prove." Williams smiled at this. She had worked with plenty of new MPs over the years, and she could usually tell within the first few days which ones would thrive and which ones would struggle. Something about Sarah's quiet confidence reminded her of herself as a young soldier. "Good attitude. Let's get you settled in, and then we'll start your orientation. You're going to be working primarily with Sergeant Jake Morrison. He's been here for 3 years and knows this base better than most people know their own neighborhoods. Pay attention to everything he tells you." Sergeant Morrison turned out to be exactly the kind of mentor that new soldiers needed. A 25-year-old from Texas with an easy smile and genuine enthusiasm for his work. He had the ability to explain complex procedures in simple terms and the patience to answer the same questions multiple times without showing frustration. The thing about MP work, Morrison explained during Sarah's first day of orientation, is that you never know what you're going to encounter. 1 hour, you might be writing a traffic ticket. The next, you could be responding to a domestic violence call or investigating a theft. The key is staying alert and being ready to adapt to whatever comes up. Their first patrol together covered the main areas of the base where military police maintained a visible presence. Morrison showed Sarah the housing areas where military families lived, the commercial district with shops and restaurants, the training areas where soldiers conducted exercises, and the administrative buildings where the business of the division was conducted. "This place is like a small city," Morrison explained as they drove through the housing areas. "We've got all the same problems that civilian police deal with, plus a few that are unique to military life. Domestic disputes, theft, drunk and disorderly conduct, traffic accidents, and occasionally more serious crimes. The difference is that everyone we deal with is either a soldier, a family member, or someone who has a legitimate reason to be on base." Sarah absorbed everything, asking questions and taking notes in a small notebook that she carried everywhere. She wanted to understand not just the procedures and regulations, but the underlying dynamics that made Fort Campbell unique. Her first week of actual patrol work was relatively quiet, which Morrison explained was typical for new MPs. "They're easing you in," he said. "Once they're confident you can handle routine calls, things will get more interesting." The routine calls were educational in their own way. Sarah learned how to conduct vehicle searches, write citations, and handle minor disputes between soldiers. She discovered that effective military police work required not just knowledge of regulations, but understanding of human nature and the ability to defuse tensions before they escalated into serious problems. Her first significant call came during her second week on duty. Morrison and Sarah responded to a domestic disturbance at one of the family housing units, where neighbors had reported loud arguing and what sounded like objects being thrown. These calls were among the most challenging for military police because they often involved complex personal situations that couldn't be solved simply by enforcing regulations. The couple involved were a young sergeant and his wife, both obviously upset and struggling to communicate effectively. The husband had recently returned from a deployment to Afghanistan, and was having difficulty readjusting to life at home. The wife had been managing household responsibilities alone for 8 months and was feeling overwhelmed by the sudden change in their routine. Morrison took the lead on the call, but he encouraged Sarah to observe carefully and contribute when appropriate. What impressed him was her ability to listen to both parties without judgment and to identify the underlying issues that were driving their conflict. "Have you both considered talking to someone at Family Life Services?" Sarah asked quietly after the immediate crisis had been defused. "They have counselors who specialize in helping families adjust after deployments. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with either of you. It just means you're dealing with a difficult transition that lots of military families face." Her suggestion was practical and delivered without condescension, and both the sergeant and his wife seemed receptive to the idea. Morrison made note of Sarah's contribution in his report, recognizing that she had demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and interpersonal skills that made the difference between good MPs and great ones. "That was well done," Morrison told her as they drove away from the call. "You saw what they actually needed, not just what they were fighting about. That's a skill that takes most people years to develop." As Sarah's confidence grew, she began to take on more responsibility and handle increasingly complex situations. She learned to conduct preliminary investigations, process crime scenes, and work with other agencies when cases required coordination between military and civilian authorities. Her size, which had initially seemed like a potential disadvantage, turned out to be an asset in many situations. People were less likely to be intimidated by her presence, which meant they were more willing to talk openly about problems they were experiencing. Her calm demeanor and careful listening skills made her particularly effective at gathering information and building trust with victims and witnesses. Staff Sergeant Williams began assigning Sarah to cases that required particular sensitivity or careful handling. When a young female soldier reported a sexual assault, Williams paired Sarah with an experienced female investigator to conduct the initial interview. When a theft investigation required interviewing junior enlisted soldiers who might be intimidated by senior MPs, Sarah's non-threatening presence helped put witnesses at ease. "You have a gift for this work," Williams told Sarah during a quarterly counseling session. "Your technical knowledge is solid, your judgment is excellent, and you have the interpersonal skills that can't be taught in a classroom. I'm recommending you for advanced investigative training." The advanced training opportunity would take Sarah to the Military Police Investigator course at Fort Leonard Wood, where she would learn sophisticated techniques for handling serious crimes, including fraud, theft, assault, and drug offenses. It was an honor typically reserved for MPs with more experience, but Sarah's performance had earned her the chance to advance her skills earlier than usual. But before she could attend the advanced course, Sarah would face a situation that would test everything she had learned about military police work and about herself. It started with what seemed like a routine patrol shift on a busy Friday evening in the base mess halls, where soldiers gathered after duty hours to eat, relax, and socialize with their friends. The main mess hall at Fort Campbell could accommodate over 1,000 soldiers at a time, and Friday evenings were always crowded as people unwound from the week's training and duties. Sarah and Morrison were conducting a routine security check, maintaining visible presence, and ensuring that the relaxed atmosphere didn't get out of hand. They had just finished checking the serving areas and were walking through the dining section when they noticed a commotion near one of the corner tables. A group of soldiers from the 2nd Brigade combat team were clustered around a table, and their conversation was becoming increasingly loud and animated. Morrison gestured for Sarah to follow as they moved closer to assess the situation. What they found was a group of male soldiers who had clearly been drinking off base before coming to the mess hall, and who were now being deliberately disruptive to other diners. The leader of the group was a sergeant named Travis Burke, a heavy-set man from Alabama who had a reputation for pushing boundaries and challenging authority. Burke was known to the MPs as someone who stayed just barely within the lines of acceptable behavior, but who seemed to enjoy testing how far he could go without facing serious consequences. "Gentlemen," Morrison said in his most professional voice, "I need to ask you to keep it down. You're disturbing other diners." Burke looked up with a smirk that Sarah immediately recognized as trouble. She had seen that expression before, on the faces of people who were looking for a confrontation rather than trying to avoid one. "We're not doing anything wrong, Sergeant," Burke replied, emphasizing Morrison's rank in a way that was technically respectful but clearly intended to be mocking. "We're just having a conversation." Morrison's response was patient but firm. "I understand that, but the volume of your conversation is affecting other people's ability to enjoy their meals. I need you to lower your voices or consider continuing your discussion outside." This was a routine request that should have been handled with a simple acknowledgement and compliance. But Burke seemed determined to make it into something more complicated. He looked around the table at his friends, clearly playing to his audience. "You know what's funny about MPs?" Burke said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "They always think they're so important, walking around here like they own the place. But most of them wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real combat unit." The comment was clearly intended to provoke a response, and Sarah could see Morrison's jaw tighten. But Morrison maintained his professional composure, understanding that Burke was trying to draw him into an argument that would only escalate the situation. "Sergeant Burke," Morrison said calmly, "I'm going to need you and your friends to lower your voices and keep your comments respectful. If you can't do that, I'll need to ask you to leave." Burke's response revealed the level of intoxication and poor judgment that was driving his behavior. Instead of complying with a reasonable request, he stood up from his chair and took a step toward Morrison, invading his personal space in a deliberately threatening manner. "Or what?" Burke said, his voice carrying clearly across the now quiet mess hall. "You gonna write me a ticket? Maybe call for backup? I bet your little partner there could really help you out." Sarah felt the eyes of hundreds of soldiers turning toward their interaction, and she understood that this situation was rapidly becoming a test not just of her professional abilities, but of her credibility as a military police officer. Burke's comment about her being a little partner was clearly intended to provoke a response, and everyone in the mess hall was waiting to see how she would handle it. Morrison was experienced enough to recognize that the situation was escalating beyond what could be resolved through conversation. Burke's aggressive posture and increasingly hostile comments indicated that he was looking for a confrontation, and the presence of his friends and the crowd of onlookers was feeding his desire to make a scene. "Sergeant Burke," Morrison said in his most authoritative voice, "you are creating a disturbance and failing to comply with lawful orders. I'm directing you to leave the mess hall immediately. If you refuse, you will be placed under apprehension." The formal language was intended to make clear that this was no longer a request, but an official order backed by the full authority of military law. Burke's response would determine whether the situation could still be resolved peacefully or whether it would require physical intervention. Burke's answer came not in words, but in action. He shoved Morrison hard in the chest, sending the surprised MP backward several steps. The assault on a military police officer crossed a line that transformed the situation from a minor disturbance into a serious incident requiring immediate action. Morrison's training kicked in immediately. He reached for his radio to call for backup, while simultaneously moving to restrain Burke and place him under arrest. But Burke wasn't finished escalating the situation. Instead of submitting to arrest as regulations required, Burke threw a wild punch at Morrison's head. Morrison ducked the blow and managed to grab Burke's arm, but the sergeant's size advantage and the confined space of the mess hall made it difficult to control him effectively. It was at this moment that Sarah faced the defining choice of her military career. She could wait for backup to arrive and help Morrison contain the situation, which would be the safe and expected response. Or she could step forward and take action herself, knowing that her performance in the next few seconds would be witnessed by hundreds of her fellow soldiers and would likely determine how she was viewed by her peers for the rest of her career. Sarah Mitchell, the farm girl from Iowa who had once worried about whether she was strong enough for military service, stepped forward without hesitation. Time seemed to slow down as Sarah watched Burke grapple with Morrison in the crowded mess hall. She could hear the scraping of chairs as soldiers pushed back from nearby tables, the sharp intake of breath from spectators, and the dull thud of bodies colliding. Morrison was skilled and experienced, but Burke outweighed him by at least 40 pounds and was fighting with the reckless abandon of someone who had consumed too much alcohol and lost control of his judgment. Sarah's mind flashed through everything she had learned during her defensive tactics training. Sergeant First Class Thompson's words echoed in her memory. Your size isn't a weakness if you use it correctly. You're quicker than larger opponents. You can move in ways they can't, and you can use their size against them. But this wasn't a training exercise with instructors watching and safety protocols in place. This was a real confrontation with real consequences, witnessed by hundreds of soldiers who would judge her performance and carry their impressions of this moment throughout her military career. The farm girl from Iowa, who had once worried about belonging in the Army, was about to find out exactly what she was made of. Burke managed to break free from Morrison's initial attempt to control him and swung another wild punch, this one connecting with Morrison's shoulder and spinning him partially around. The impact sent Morrison stumbling backward into a table, scattering trays and drinks across the floor. "Come on," Burke shouted, his voice carrying across the silent mess hall. "Is this the best the MPs can do? Send me someone who can actually fight." The taunt was directed at Morrison, but Sarah understood that it was really directed at her. Burke had noticed her presence and was deliberately challenging her to get involved. In his alcohol-impaired judgment, he probably thought that provoking the small female MP would be amusing and would further demonstrate his dominance over the military police. He had no idea what he was about to encounter. Sarah stepped forward with the calm, measured movement of someone who had thought through her next actions carefully. She didn't rush or telegraph her intentions. Instead, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who understood exactly what needed to happen and exactly how to make it happen. "Sergeant Burke," she said in a clear, carrying voice, "you are under arrest for assault on a military police officer. Place your hands behind your back and turn around." Burke turned toward her with her expression of disbelief that quickly transformed into contemptuous amusement. At 5 feet 2 inches and 115 pounds, Sarah looked like someone who would have trouble restraining an uncooperative teenager, let alone a grown man who was larger than she was, and clearly prepared to resist arrest. "Are you kidding me?" Burke laughed, loud enough for the entire mess hall to hear. "They sent the little girl to arrest me? What's next? Are they going to send the Girl Scouts?" His friends at the table joined in the laughter, and Sarah could feel the attention of every person in the mess hall focused on this moment. Some soldiers were probably expecting to see her humiliated. Others might have been hoping she would prove herself. But everyone understood that what happened in the next few minutes would define not just Sarah's reputation, but would send a message about the competence and authority of military police in general. Sarah's response was characteristically calm and professional. "Sergeant Burke, this is your final warning. Submit to arrest immediately, or you will be taken into custody by force." Burke's answer came in the form of action rather than words. He took a swing at Sarah's head, a wild, overhand punch that would have been devastating if it had connected. But Sarah had been watching his body language, reading his intentions, and anticipating his moves from the moment she stepped forward. She ducked under the punch with fluid grace, feeling the wind from his fist passing inches over her head. Before Burke could recover his balance or prepare another attack, Sarah struck with precision that would have impressed her old defensive tactics instructors. Using Burke's own momentum against him, Sarah grabbed his extended arm and executed a perfect hip throw that sent the much larger man crashing to the floor with tremendous force. The technique was flawless, using leverage and timing rather than strength to control her opponent. Burke hit the floor hard, the impact driving the breath from his lungs and leaving him momentarily stunned. But Sarah wasn't finished. She had learned from her training that controlling a larger opponent required maintaining the initiative and never allowing them the opportunity to use their size advantage. As Burke tried to push himself up from the floor, Sarah applied a control hold that her instructors would have recognized as textbook perfect. She used pressure points and joint manipulation to keep Burke immobilized while causing him enough discomfort to discourage any thoughts of continued resistance. The entire sequence from Burke's initial punch to Sarah having him completely controlled on the floor took less than 15 seconds. The execution was so smooth and professional that many spectators had trouble processing what they had just witnessed. "Stop resisting," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady and controlled despite the physical exertion. "Any movement you make will only cause yourself pain." Burke, still struggling to catch his breath and orient himself to his new position on the floor, made the mistake of trying to buck Sarah off and regain his feet. The result was immediate and educational. Sarah adjusted her hold slightly, and Burke's attempt at resistance was rewarded with sharp pain that convinced him to stop moving. "I said stop resisting," Sarah repeated, her tone still professional, but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. "Sergeant Morrison, could you please call for transport and assistance with processing?" Morrison, who had been momentarily stunned by the speed and effectiveness of Sarah's intervention, quickly radioed for backup and began clearing space around Sarah and her prisoner. The professional manner in which Sarah was handling the situation helped him regain his own composure and focus on the procedural requirements of the arrest. The mess hall remained silent except for the sound of Sarah reading Burke's rights and the radio chatter as additional MPs responded to the scene. Hundreds of soldiers watched as the small female MP maintained complete control over a much larger male soldier who had been causing problems just minutes earlier. Burke's friends, who had been laughing and encouraging his resistance just moments before, now sat quietly at their table, clearly reconsidering their own involvement in the incident. The entertainment value of the situation had evaporated completely when they realized that their friend was not only losing the confrontation, but was likely facing serious disciplinary action. When backup MPs arrived on the scene, they found Sarah maintaining professional control of the situation while Morrison completed the paperwork and witness statements. The additional officers were experienced enough to recognize skilled police work when they saw it, and their expressions of approval communicated respect for Sarah's performance. "Outstanding work, Mitchell," said Sergeant First Class Davis, the senior MP who responded to the call. That was exactly how this type of situation should be handled. Professional, controlled, and effective. The processing of Burke revealed that this incident was more serious than a simple case of disorderly conduct. His assault on Morrison constituted battery against a military police officer, which carried significant penalties under military law. His resistance to arrest and continued fighting added additional charges. The witnesses in the mess hall, many of whom provided voluntary statements, confirmed that Burke had been the aggressor throughout the incident and that both MPs had acted appropriately and professionally. As Burke was transported to the detention facility for processing, Sarah finally had a moment to reflect on what had just happened. The confrontation that had seemed so threatening and overwhelming just minutes earlier was now resolved, and she had handled it with a competence that surprised even herself. Morrison approached her as they finished collecting witness statements and completing their incident reports. "Sarah, I need to thank you. That situation could have gotten completely out of hand if you hadn't acted when you did. Burke was way out of line, and you handled him perfectly." The praise from her more experienced partner meant a great deal, but Sarah was most struck by how natural the entire encounter had felt. Despite the high stakes and the public nature of the confrontation, she had never felt panicked or uncertain about what needed to be done. Her training had prepared her well, but more importantly, her own inner strength and confidence had carried her through the most challenging situation of her military career. Word of the incident spread quickly through Fort Campbell, as significant events always do on military installations. By the next morning, Sarah found herself receiving congratulations and expressions of respect from soldiers throughout the base. The story had grown somewhat in the telling, as stories tend to do, but the essential facts remained accurate. A small female MP had professionally and effectively handled a much larger male soldier who was out of control. Staff Sergeant Williams called Sarah into her office the morning after the incident for a formal debriefing. Williams had reviewed the incident reports, witness statements, and the official documentation of Burke's arrest and charges. "Mitchell," Williams said, looking up from the paperwork, "this is exactly the kind of performance we expect from military police officers. You remained calm under pressure, used appropriate levels of force, and resolved a dangerous situation without anyone getting seriously hurt. I'm putting you in for a commendation." The formal recognition was gratifying, but Sarah was more impressed by the change in how other soldiers on the base treated her. Where she had previously been seen as the new MP who was still learning the job, she was now viewed as a competent professional who could be counted on in difficult situations. The impact extended beyond her immediate work environment. Sarah began receiving requests from training instructors who wanted to use her incident as a case study for teaching proper defensive tactics and situational control. Her technique and decision-making became examples of how smaller officers could effectively handle larger opponents through superior training and professional judgment. But perhaps the most significant outcome of the mess hall incident was Sarah's own growing understanding of her capabilities and potential. The doubts and uncertainties that had followed her since joining the military were finally resolved. She belonged in uniform, she was good at her job, and she could handle whatever challenges came her way. The incident also solidified her relationship with Morrison and the other MPs in her unit. She had proven herself under the most demanding circumstances, and her fellow officers now viewed her as a full partner rather than a rookie who needed protection and guidance. Burke's case proceeded through the military justice system with predictable results. His assault on MPs combined with his resistance to arrest and disorderly conduct, resulted in reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and additional duty assignments. More importantly, from Sarah's perspective, his behavior had been witnessed by hundreds of soldiers who now understood that military police authority was not negotiable, regardless of the size or appearance of the individual officer. The mess hall incident became a defining moment in Sarah's military career, but not because it represented the peak of her achievements. Rather, it marked the point where she fully accepted her own competence and stopped questioning whether she belonged in the military police. From this point forward, she would approach her duties with the quiet confidence of someone who had been tested and had proven herself capable. Her fellow MPs began seeking her advice on handling difficult situations, recognizing that her combination of technical knowledge, emotional intelligence, and proven courage under pressure made her a valuable resource. Senior officers began considering her for advanced responsibilities and specialized assignments that would further develop her skills and leadership potential. The farm girl from Iowa who had once worried about being strong enough for military service had discovered that true strength came from within, and that competence and character were more important than physical size. She had found her place in the military community, and that community had embraced her as one of their own. But Sarah's biggest challenge still lay ahead. The mess hall incident had established her reputation and credibility, but it would be her response to an even more serious confrontation that would define her legacy and demonstrate the full extent of the inner strength that had been developing since her childhood on that small farm in Iowa. 6 months after the mess hall incident, Sarah had settled into a routine that reflected her growing status within the 716th Military Police Battalion. Her daily responsibilities now included training new MPs, conducting complex investigations, and serving as a liaison between the military police and other units on Fort Campbell. The quiet confidence that had emerged during her confrontation with Sergeant Burke had matured into genuine leadership presence that her superiors and peers alike recognized and respected. The commendation she received for her handling of Burke had been formally presented by the battalion commander, Colonel Martinez, during a ceremony attended by MPs from throughout the installation. The recognition was meaningful not just for Sarah personally, but because it sent a clear message about the standards expected from military police officers and the department's commitment to supporting soldiers who upheld those standards professionally and courageously. But the real measure of Sarah's transformation came in her daily interactions with the soldiers and families she served. Her reputation for fairness, competence, and calm professionalism had spread throughout Fort Campbell, and people specifically requested her involvement when they faced serious problems that required careful handling. She had become particularly skilled at domestic violence investigations, where her ability to establish trust with victims and her patient, non-threatening interviewing style helped uncover information that more intimidating officers might miss. Her size, which had once seemed like a potential disadvantage, had proven to be an asset when working with traumatized victims who might be frightened by larger, more imposing authority figures. Staff Sergeant Williams had recommended Sarah for promotion ahead of the normal timeline, noting in her evaluation that she demonstrated leadership potential that warranted accelerated advancement. The recommendation had been endorsed by the company commander and was making its way through the approval process with strong support from everyone who had worked with Sarah. "You've become exactly the kind of MP we need more of," Williams told Sarah during their regular mentoring sessions. "You understand that this job isn't about exercising authority over people. It's about serving the community and maintaining the standards that make military life work for everyone." Sarah's parents visited Fort Campbell during the spring, their first trip to see their daughter since she had completed basic training nearly 2 years earlier. The transformation in their daughter was immediately apparent to them, not just in her physical bearing and professional confidence, but in the genuine sense of purpose and belonging that she radiated. "I always knew you were strong, sweetheart," her mother said as they toured Sarah's workplace and met her colleagues. "But seeing you here, watching how people respect you and rely on you, makes me understand that you've found exactly where you belong." Her father, a man of few words who had worried about his daughter's decision to join the military, expressed his pride more simply. "You've made something of yourself, Sarah. Your mom and I are proud of what you've accomplished, but we're even more proud of who you've become." The visit allowed Sarah to reflect on her journey from the uncertain farm girl who had enlisted primarily for financial reasons to the confident professional she had become. Military service had given her far more than career training and educational opportunities. It had provided a framework for discovering and developing capabilities she had never known she possessed. Her letters home during this period reflected growing excitement about her career prospects and genuine enthusiasm for the work she was doing. She wrote about complex cases she had solved, training sessions she had led, and the sense of satisfaction that came from making a real difference in people's lives. "I never imagined that being an MP would involve so much counseling and problem solving," she wrote to her parents. "People come to us not just when they've broken rules, but when their lives are falling apart and they don't know where else to turn. Being able to help them find solutions and resources feels more meaningful than anything I thought I would do in the military." Her growing reputation had attracted attention from outside her immediate unit. The Criminal Investigation Division had approached her about cross-training in specialized investigative techniques, recognizing that her combination of analytical skills and interpersonal abilities made her a natural fit for complex criminal cases. The military police school at Fort Leonard Wood had invited her to return as an instructor, offering her the opportunity to share her experience and knowledge with new generations of MPs. The invitation was particularly meaningful because it represented recognition from the institution that had shaped her early military career. But the opportunity that most excited Sarah was the chance to attend officer candidate school and commission as a lieutenant. Her chain of command had strongly endorsed her application, citing her demonstrated leadership abilities and her potential for increased responsibility. "You have all the qualities we look for in officers," Colonel Martinez told her during the interview for OCS. "You understand that leadership is about serving others, not commanding them. You make good decisions under pressure, and you have the respect of everyone who works with you. The Army needs more officers like you." The prospect of becoming an officer represented the culmination of a transformation that had begun in that small farmhouse in Iowa and had accelerated through every challenge and opportunity of her military career. From a young woman who had worried about whether she belonged in the Army, Sarah had evolved into someone who the Army wanted to invest in and develop for positions of greater responsibility. Her acceptance into officer candidate school came with orders to report to Fort Benning, Georgia, the same installation where she had completed basic training years earlier. The symmetry felt appropriate, as if her journey was coming full circle while simultaneously moving toward new horizons. The night before her departure for OCS, Sarah's unit held a farewell celebration that reflected the genuine affection and respect she had earned from her colleagues. The gathering included not just MPs from her immediate unit, but soldiers from throughout Fort Campbell who had worked with her or been helped by her professional service. Morrison, who had become both a mentor and close friend, spoke for the group during the informal ceremony. Sarah Mitchell came to us as a new MP who had a lot to learn and a lot to prove. She's leaving us as one of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to work with. But more than that, she's shown all of us what it means to serve with integrity and courage. Staff Sergeant Williams presented Sarah with a framed photograph of their unit and a letter of recommendation that she could carry throughout her military career. You set a standard for professionalism and leadership that everyone in this unit will remember, Williams said. Whatever challenges you face as an officer, remember that you've already proven you can handle anything the Army throws at you. The recognition from her peers meant more to Sarah than any formal awards or commendations could have. These were the people who had worked alongside her, who had seen her in action during the most demanding situations, and who understood the quality of her character and competence from firsthand experience. As Sarah prepared to leave Fort Campbell and begin the next phase of her military career, she received a letter that brought unexpected perspective to her journey. The letter was from Sergeant Burke, the soldier she had arrested in the mess hall incident months earlier. Burke's letter was handwritten and reflected genuine remorse for his behavior and recognition of the professionalism Sarah had demonstrated during their confrontation. He had completed his disciplinary actions and was requesting transfer to another installation for a fresh start, but he wanted Sarah to know that her handling of their incident had ultimately helped him recognize problems in his own behavior and attitude. I was completely out of line that night, Burke wrote, and I want you to know that I respect how you handled the situation. You could have hurt me or embarrassed me worse than you did, but you were professional throughout. I've learned from what happened, and I'm trying to be a better soldier because of it. The letter reminded Sarah that effective law enforcement wasn't about punishment or dominance, but about maintaining standards and helping people make better choices. Burke's recognition of her professionalism validated her approach to military police work and reinforced her belief that treating people with dignity and respect, even when they were behaving badly, produced better outcomes for everyone involved. Officer Candidate School would bring new challenges and opportunities for growth, but Sarah approached it with the quiet confidence of someone who had already proven herself capable of handling whatever obstacles might arise. The farm girl from Iowa who had once worried about being strong enough for military service now understood that strength came in many forms, and that her particular combination of intelligence, emotional resilience, and moral courage made her uniquely qualified for leadership responsibility. Her story had become part of the culture of Fort Campbell, told to new MPs as an example of how size and appearance could be deceiving and how true strength was measured not in physical power but in character and competence. The mess hall incident had become a teaching case used in defensive tactics training, demonstrating how proper technique and professional judgment could overcome significant physical disadvantages. But for Sarah herself, the incident represented something more personal and profound. It marked the moment when she finally and completely accepted her place in the military community, when all doubts about her belonging and capabilities were permanently resolved. From that point forward, she had approached every challenge with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was capable of achieving. The drive to Fort Benning for Officer Candidate School took Sarah through familiar territory, past the small towns and agricultural landscapes that reminded her of her childhood in Iowa. The journey gave her time to reflect on how much had changed since she first put on a military uniform, and how much she had discovered about herself through the challenges and opportunities of military service. The uncertain young woman who had enlisted primarily to help her family financially had evolved into a confident professional who was being prepared for positions of significant responsibility and leadership. Military service had provided not just career training and educational opportunities, but a framework for personal growth and self-discovery that had revealed capabilities she had never imagined she possessed. As Fort Benning came into view, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of nervousness and excitement that accompanied every new phase of her military career. Officer Candidate School would be demanding in different ways than her previous training, focusing on leadership development and the increased responsibilities that came with commission rank. But she approached this challenge with the same methodical preparation and quiet determination that had carried her through every previous obstacle. She understood that becoming an officer would require continued growth and learning, but she also knew that her foundation of experience and character would serve her well in meeting whatever expectations the Army placed on her. The farm girl from Iowa, who had once worried about whether she was strong enough for military service, was now preparing to become a leader responsible for developing and caring for other soldiers. The transformation was complete in some ways, but Sarah understood that it was also ongoing, that growth and learning would continue throughout her military career and beyond. Officer Candidate School would be just another step in a journey that had begun with a dinner conversation in a small farmhouse and had led through challenges and triumphs that had forged an unshakable sense of purpose and belonging. Sarah Mitchell had found her calling, and her calling had found her ready to meet whatever responsibilities lay ahead. The legacy of the mess hall incident would continue to influence military police training and culture long after Sarah had moved on to other assignments and greater responsibilities. But her most important legacy would be the example she set for other young soldiers who might doubt their own capabilities or wonder whether they had what it took to succeed in military service. Sarah's story proved that strength came in many forms, that competence mattered more than appearance, and that courage and character could overcome any physical limitation. For the soldiers who would follow in her footsteps, her example would serve as inspiration and proof that the most important battles were won not through superior force, but through superior spirit and unshakable determination to do what was right. The farm girl from Iowa had become exactly what the Army needed her to become, and in doing so, she had discovered exactly who she was meant to be.